Okay, so we'll start. Thank you so much for coming. So this is the Center for Ethics and Human Values monthly conversation about research ethics. And thank you so much for the panelists for coming. I'm really excited about today. So just for people that are new, these conversations happen once a month. We have a sign-up sheet, so please, if you're interested, you can sign up and get monthly emails to update. And basically the idea behind these conversations is to have faculty-led discussions that get at the heart of ethical issues related to research that go beyond the sort of regulatory requirements. And I'm really pleased to have Dr. Katrina Claw, who is coming to us from the University of Colorado Anschutz, right, medical campus. And she is a genomic scientist. She received her PhD at University of Washington and was also a postdoctoral fellow there at the School of Pharmacy. And joining her, we have two esteemed panelists from Ohio State, Dr. Matthew Anderson, who's from the Department of Microbiology, and he and Dr. Claw actually participated in the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics consortium, SING, that 2 years ago wrote, I think, a really important article on providing a framework for enhancing ethical genomic research with Indigenous communities that was out in Nature Communications in 2018. I would definitely recommend it, and we'll put it on our CHV website so you could read it. And then we will also have Dr. Daniel Rivers from the Department of History and also the director of the American Indian Studies program here, also bringing his perspective as a historian on some of these ethical issues. And so let me just sort of tell you the structure of the panel. We're going to invite Dr. Katrina Claw to present, sort of give us an overview of some of these ethical issues related to genomics research. Genomics research has allowed us to take great strides in providing better medical care for everybody, except there are still underrepresented populations in the research, including Indigenous communities. And given historical wrongdoing on the part of researchers and lack of transparency and lack of community input, there's a lot of reasons and just for why Indigenous peoples and members of tribes are less than eager to share their medical information and participate in research. And so hopefully today we'll sort of get the conversation going about, how to think about research done ethically in a way that has equitable health outcomes and is inclusive. And so Dr. Claw is going to come up and speak for about 15 minutes. Then I'm going to give Dr. Anderson and Dr. Rivers about 8 minutes each to sort of respond and give their own perspective, but the point is really to engage in a conversation with all of us. So then we have a set of questions that we are going to sort of discuss for about 30 minutes and then open it up for discussion with all of you. So to no further ado, and thank you to the College of Public Health, the Center for Bioethics, and for the Office of Research for funding this series. And thank you for all of you for coming on a great day. All right, so we'll have Dr. Claw come.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Yat good afternoon. She'eya Katrina Tla Yanishya Tuahana Nishli Go Dashchini Bashichin Twitch Ini Dashache but Ani Dashanella Diet Dinastana Nishli. So I just introduced myself in my native language. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation, the Diné tribe, and originally grew up in Arizona. My family is all still there. Also, I want to acknowledge, first and foremost, the Indigenous peoples of these lands, and these are the Miami, the Delaware, the Wyandotte, and Pawnee tribes. So, Shawnee tribes. So, yes, I would really like to acknowledge the original peoples of these lands that we are all on today. So with that, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Today, I'll be talking about ethics in genomic research with indigenous communities. And really, this stems from two main questions that I think of in all of my research. How do we make sure that genomic medicine does not exclude underserved and disadvantaged populations? So as more and more genomic studies are pursued, how do we do this in a respectful and culturally appropriate way with Native communities? And how can we as researchers, as institutions, as funders, as students, as people of our nations and people at these institutions engage with Native communities and tribes in genomic research? And also, how do we assure that everyone benefits from this research? We talk about genomic medicine as kind of a Cadillac medicine. Not everyone can afford a Cadillac. So how do we ensure that everyone can have some benefits from this? And how do we ensure that people are not harmed? I really want to start out with this quote to give this context. So this is Hastin Jil Hajane. He is also known as Chief Manuelito in our tribe. So this was from the late 1800s. He says, "We cannot fight them. There are very few of us compared to them. We have to fight the injustices of our people with education. They have people out there called lawyers, doctors, and engineers, and that is how we will win the battle. Education is part of the answer. Go and tell the Navajo people that education is the ladder." So I think this really puts into context our indigenous communities today. A lot of our families, my parents went to boarding school, and they really instilled in us the drive and the need for us to go out, get an education, and then come back to our people, come and help your people. And so this can happen in a variety of ways. Even though I'm at the University of Colorado, I have a research project now with my tribe, which I'll mention briefly towards the end of my 15 minutes, but there are different ways that we as researchers and students can work and impact indigenous communities and our tribes. Within health research, there has been a long history of distrust and tribal members being taken advantage of, and this is especially prevalent in the health sciences and biomedical. There's definitely a colonial epistemology that comes into play when we look at all of these studies. These are peer-reviewed studies from the early, from about 1930s, 1928. But one of the main questions of one of these papers was to determine the question of whether the true Indian is dying out. And then there's one that says the Navajo population problem. I wasn't aware that there was a problem. So these are really coming from a biased perspective. We think that science is unbiased, but it's actually not. We bring our culture, we bring our backgrounds into any science that we do. So in terms of genomics, this is a really popular paper that was published a couple years ago, but it really highlights the disparities in genomic research. So this is showing a graph from 2009, and then this study was done again in 2016. But basically, the black portion of the pie chart is all of the genome-wide association studies that were done around the world. The black part is showing that most of these, about 81% to 96%, are done in European descent populations. The little blue slivers are showing every other population around the world. So in 2016, this increased to about 14%, but a lot of that was largely driven by a lot of the work being done in Asia and China. So the little light blue sliver, if you can see it, is showing the Asian contribution to this pie chart. I don't know if this works. No, okay, but I think you can see that. But the little sliver, dark blue sliver, is showing all of the other populations around the world, including African Americans, including American Indians. So when we look at these studies, I'm showing in yellow here from 2009 to 2019, the Indigenous proportion of this pie chart. So in 2009, we had about 0.06% representation in genomic studies. That increased to about 0.05% in 2016, and then a recent study in 2019 showed that it was 0.022%. So that is really a disparity. When we think about Indigenous peoples across the US, across the world, we're much more populous than 0.022%. And within the United States, there are over 573 recognized tribes in the United States. And here I'm just showing some of the tribal lands and reservations that exist. About 70% of tribal members are urban natives, so they live in urban centers. Popular ones are Chicago, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and so we're all over the country. But in some of the reasons why there's a lack of representation in research, this can come from the researcher institutional perspective, or it can come from the community perspective. So from the researcher institutional perspective, in genomic research, a lot of researchers favor the use of using existing cohorts. There might be limited recruitment because a lot of this might occur at medical centers, and often not a lot of the population goes to those centers. From the community side, there's also historical distrust, perceived lack of benefit of genomic medicine or genomic research, and then there's also a lot of other priorities than participating in a research study. So here I'm just listing a couple of the reasons. I'm not going to go into depth with this, but for in particular, genomic studies, there are a lot of unique considerations that tribes have to think about. One, and first and foremost, is tribal sovereignty, making sure that research studies, not only genomic, but any, are corresponding with research oversight and guidelines. And also thinking about individual versus group consent. This has been an issue with tribal communities where the entire group is not asked, but the individuals are asked instead. And then also so some tribes have research oversight, but then what about in urban settings where there's not a clear body who has oversight? So, and then obviously a lot of concern over the storage and future use of data and samples. This was mentioned earlier, so this is the paper that Matt and I and colleagues from the SING Consortium published in 2018, where we came up with a framework for enhancing ethical genomic research with Indigenous communities. I'm not going to go into depth with it, but I think there's some very clear ways that we can move forward in ethical research. So this is one of our main figures in the paper, showing how we can bridge the gap between communities and researchers. So we built this framework to build trust, to increase inclusion, and also to enhance ethical research practices. So I like to look at this from starting from the cultural competency, because that's the east side, and Navajos, we always start from the east. So here I'm going to start from the center and then go from the east around. So the center, first and foremost, researchers need to understand sovereignty and research regulations. And then going outwards, engaging the community, and then improving and building cultural competency, improving transparency throughout the research process, supporting capacity building, so with students and with the tribal communities, and also distributing the research findings in creative and alternative ways rather than just the typical research paper. And throughout this, we included some values: respect, equity, and then there's two more, let's see, beneficence. Okay. So I just wanted to give a couple examples of how in the research that I've done, how we can employ these principles. So starting from sovereignty, if you're from the get-go, your study, a lot of studies that I've been in acknowledge that tribal sovereignty by saying that the data and the samples belong to the tribe and will be returned to the tribe after the study has completed. So this is one way that I've been able to work with tribal communities. And then we not only get individual consent, but we get group consent by going to the tribal, wherever the tribe wants us to get consent or support from, we go there, as well as getting individual consent. And then I think that in the future, we need to start thinking more about how to integrate urban natives as well as native people who live on tribal lands. And this has to be thought more in depth. And then cultural competency, how do we integrate cultural and traditional knowledge into the research study? So in a lot of the work we do, we have community advisory groups where you can get the views and perspectives of tribal members in the study goal and actually the design and future projects. So we've done that. And it's also being reviewed by the tribal IRB as well as community researchers. And then how do you be transparent? So sharing the consent process in detail with the community group, and also designating the storage of data and future use of the data before the study has even started with the tribe. And then for capacity building, I'm not going to talk in depth about this, but I've been very fortunate to be involved in the SING consortium. That's a summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics. And Matt is one of the co-leaders of our SING workshop every year. So we've done a lot of work encouraging and supporting students to pursue genomics and the sciences and ethics in this space. That's one way we've been trying to build capacity. And then lastly, distribution of findings and knowledge. So we try to publish not only in typical peer-reviewed publications, but also reaching out, doing community forums, hosting radio talk shows, and then making pamphlets, newsletters, and actually social media is a great way to get your research findings out there. So with that, I just want to conclude with this quote by Dr. Kim Tallbear, who is a faculty member for SING USA, but also they recently started SING Canada. She said, if you're going to work with Indigenous communities on genetics, you have to be willing to make lifelong relations. So that's what I'm doing now as a new faculty member, starting to make these relationships with tribal communities before I start any research. But in terms of ethics, I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the current ethics projects that I'm involved in. One of the main projects is with Dr. Nanaba Garrison, and we are looking at perspectives on genetic research in the Navajo Nation. I don't know if many people are aware, but the Navajo Nation has a moratorium or ban on all genetic research, and this has been in place since 2002. So we are currently working with the Navajo Nation to see what people think about genetic research and also trying to develop a genetic research policy. I'm also working with Dr. Erica Woodall at the University of Montana, and we are looking at genome-wide perspectives of research among the Salish and Kootenai tribes out there in Montana. And then lastly, with Dr. Chip Caldwell at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we are starting up a project where we're looking at the ethics of studying indigenous ancient DNA. So this has been coming up in the media where people are using bones from the past and extracting DNA and forming conclusions based on that. But these are also our ancestors and have to be treated with respect. So in conclusion, I just want to say that Indigenous scientists and Indigenous people are really trying to shift the research paradigm where we're using ethical and community-based engaged approach to increase diversity in the sciences. And genomics is only one tool in a much bigger picture. I think that we need to integrate a lot of these different tools together to best help our communities. So with that, Ahiaha, thank you. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm very new, so. But also, if you're a student, I am accepting students, and if anyone is interested in a research position, I'm looking for a research assistant. Thank you. Ahiaha.
We are going to share microphones. So now I'm going to give Dr. Anderson and also Dr. Rivers about 8 minutes to just share their own personal experiences in research, and also thinking about potentially what is distinctive about the ethical challenges of genomics research from their background.
Thank you so much. A little bit of a historical interlude here. I'll go next. First, a huge thanks to everybody who put the labor into getting this together and for including me. It's really nice to have the disciplines come together. So a little bit of background on the Indian Health Service, right, historically. First period of consolidation is around 1908, 1910. That's not an accident. The end of the Western Wars were in the 1880s, 1890s. The final violent sort of decimation of Indian resistance in terms of military power and ability to push back the invasion. After that, we see a period of assimilation, the boarding schools that Dr. Claw alluded to. And in that period of assimilation, the health service and the establishment of this health service was a part of that, was a part of a kind of new era of domination, bureaucratically, through educational systems. But the Indian Health Service as we know it really congeals around 1952-55, and that's an era of, we call the era of termination policies, when there was sort of the last effort to destroy the tribes and to rewrite the agreements that they had made with the federal government over hundreds of years. And the Indian Health Service suspiciously emerges out of that moment, the moment of termination and sort of renewed attacks on tribal sovereignty. So just a little overview on that. Some of the most important abuses to watch out for. My mother was involuntarily sterilized. I grew up in cars. We were living in a car, and she was involuntarily sterilized after the birth of my sister. As a Native woman, a poor Native woman, we think that in the 1970s, somewhere from 30 to 50% of small tribes, women of childbearing age, were sterilized without their consent, with the complicity of the Indian Health Service and their doctors. So, you know, many of us in the room were alive at that point, so we want to sort of keep that in mind. Those are very real experiences that Native peoples are very, very cognizant of when they're engaging with structures of science and medicine. Really great comments by Dr. Claw. I was thinking about the issues raised. Urban and rural is really important because of the centrifugal force that moves Native Americans finally away from Indian country, outside of their spaces, into more urban spaces, World War II and labor. So that now we have about 60 to 70% of Native Americans living off reservation spaces. And the way in which the sort of benefits of research, but also the safeguards of research deal with the different situations of both of those populations is really, really important. The group consent is really impressive. I think that's a beautiful thing. Probably it's the thing I don't need to teach people so much, but just in case, as a Native historian, many of us Indigenous peoples have a persistent understanding of the past as a pattern of basically moments where the U.S. government made a handful of individuals sign treaties that then affected the whole rest of the tribe, basically, right? So the group versus individual thing is a very important thing in Indian country. We have understandings, and they're different from tribe to tribe. I'm citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, Halito, Yakoki for common. and our understanding of self and other and corporate whole is specific to us. But the notions of reciprocity and of the responsibilities of the individual to the whole are something that we all share as Native nations. And those are really important considerations in research that are different. I'm happy I don't have to do that. I'm working on the research for my next book, which is going to be a social history of Two-Spirit LGBT Native Americans from World War II to the present. I teach LGBT history too. And I'm happy that I would just spent 4 days in Grand Junction. It's so nice to have Navajo presence here. We don't get Navajo folks here too much out east. But I was interviewing a woman named Erna Paha, who full-blood Navajo lesbian activist, came off the reservation in the 60s. And I'm happy I didn't have to have a conversation with the research board of the Navajo to sit with Erna and do oral histories, right? So I'm just being vulnerable here and saying that I'm happy I don't have to do what I think you all should do, right? Because group consent, man, that's heavy. And I wanted to just throw out a question. You know, I don't know if you all know this, but in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act changed everything in terms of tribal governance. I think 180 tribes signed on to it. And when they did, they ostensibly got scientific, rational-based governments, restructurings. I say that with lots of sarcasm underneath it. The Navajo, in many ways, I think, very beautifully said no. They said no to Collier and refused actually to reorganize the governments. But one of the problems with the Collier-era governments that we still exist with today, the tribal governments are Collier-era, many of them across the country, is that they set up tribal councils that really have a lot of power. These tribal councils are not checked and balanced in many situations by bicameral structures, right? By other structures of government that would sort of push back on their power. And so tribes themselves under these IRA constitutions are riven with conflict. And many people in the tribes feel completely divorced from the governments and the tribal councils that are set up. So I guess I would have that question, that if we're going to go in and we're going to dialogue with the group, who gets to say what the group is? Are we worried about these IRA governments and the way they've kind of excluded a whole lot of folks? Most famously traditionals, the Lakota in the early 70s struggled with this most famously. So in my own work, I'm right now interviewing LGBT Two-Spirit activists and looking at the emergence of what I call the Two-Spirit movement. It's a new way of conceiving of queerness, of sexuality, of gender, of native sovereignty, of self-care. It's really quite complicated, and it emerges from 89 to 92. And it emerges out of the cauldron of the epidemic, of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And what happens is that the Indian Health Service, true to form, and the federal government seriously underreports AIDS cases in Indian country. So that by the early 1990s, many reputable scholars are saying there's a horrible underreporting problem and that people are dying and being neglected. And what happens is that LGBT Native Americans who had formed their own organizations in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York in the mid-70s go to the reservation spaces and they actually work with the tribes and they heal over a lot of intense struggles with homophobia. I mean, these are really complex things, I'm going through fast, but many of these individuals in the late 60s had left their tribal spaces because they felt like their sexual orientation, their identity, their desire was unrecognized, but now there was a period of coming back together. And these individuals, because they'd worked in the metropoles at the onset of the epidemic, at ground zero, if you will, had huge information. And they brought it back to their own tribes with cultural sort of understandings of what it would mean to have those conversations. And that moment of synergy and healing and care and coming together is actually right at the foundation of the Two-Spirit movement. And so I guess I would say that to honor the ways that when citizens of indigenous nations, when we are allowed to have control, when we are allowed to sort of set the parameters of the research and the work, what incredible healing potentials, what new ways of thinking from within indigenous communities can come about. And my focus would be on that, right? Would be on thinking about the ways in which we can empower indigenous communities and to address some of these urban and rural divides that have plagued us since the 1950s and the possibilities in that. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
8 minutes? All right. So that's actually a good place to pick up. Sio Nagada, Man Anderson Dawdo, Tsitso Lagi, So hi everyone, I'm Matt Anderson, Eastern Bend, Cherokee. This idea of empowerment is kind of where I'm gonna start, where I'm gonna kind of go with things, and to highlight some of the issues that both Dr. Rivers and Dr. Claude talked about. There's been this need for some aspects of self-determination within the space of biomedical research, right? Because of distrust within IHS, because of distrust within the medical facilities that currently exist, Native people, generally speaking, and I'm not speaking, well, let me open that more broadly. Indigenous people globally have seen very similar situations and therefore very similar needs. And so as Dr. Claw alluded to, this expansion of this program called the Summer Internship for Indigenous People in Genomics, which is a direct effort to bring tribal people from all across what is now the United States in order to get a basic understanding of how genetics is done, what are some of the basic genomic concepts when it comes to human-focused genetic research at least, and what are the ethical, legal, and social implications of doing that work within an Indian country broadly defined, so that when they go back to their own communities, they can essentially act as an ambassador or representative for their people to be able to interface not only with their own communities, but also potentially with researchers coming in from outside the communities, okay? And this has been seen globally, which is why Sing USA, which started kind of under the tutelage of a non-Indian himself, Whippin Mali, who's a well-known anthropologist within the University of Illinois, saw this need as he was a graduate student for these kind of operations to exist, because he went into a tribal community, realized he had no idea what he was doing as a researcher, and realized that he really couldn't communicate with the community in the way that he wanted to. So because of these needs that are still being felt globally, Sing USA has expanded into Sing Canada, Sing Aotearoa, New Zealand, Sing Australia began this last year, and then there's talk of Sing Mexico opening up in the next year or two, depending on how things go. So this is, I think it's important to realize that this is not only an artifact of the way the colonization occurred here in the United States and North America, but it's a global issue that all people are dealing with. So this workshop specifically exists to be able to empower individuals within their communities so that the communities get empowered. So far, there's been individuals trained through this thing from 150 different tribal nations within the United States, which is great, but honestly, we need more. If you think about 150 nations, that means that there's, about 400 nations where nobody's necessarily trained in this, which is still the majority. And so if you as a academic or a researcher or somebody local ends up interacting with a tribal community as part of a research project, there may be no one there that's had these experiences or had this training to be able to interact with you. And I think that this is a place where the academic community doesn't quite realize that that's necessarily going to be true, where academics are typically going to enter those settings assuming that if I bring it down, it's like kind of like watching a Nobel laureate speak, right? They give the worst talks. They give the worst talks because they're usually thinking way up here. And so they try and bring it down for general audiences, but it's never like where it needs to be. It's always still here. And they're stumbling through it, which makes it even harder to understand what's going on. So in order to be able to engage these communities, there needs to be some training both on the researcher side and how to approach this. Part of this was addressed through a number of papers that have come out over the last 10 years, but as well on the tribal side, so that hopefully there's somebody that can engage with researchers that are coming in a little bit more on the researcher's terms almost, if you will. So these efforts, and hopefully some of these efforts within academics as well, have really been spurred by the fact that within the last 10 years, the vast majority of PhDs in genetics who are Native have come out. So I think we have 8 Native PhDs now. I think it's 8.
Wow, right on.
But when I graduated from grad school, which wasn't that long ago, it was 2010, I was number 5, I think. I was number 5. And I think Katrina and I could basically name all of them. And we're friends with basically all of them. And this is the issue right now, is in order to understand how to do that work, there's not enough of us coming from different tribal nations to be able to do that work, and it really, a lot of the onus does lie on the researcher. I don't want to go over too much.
Thank you. So actually, the first question is just sort of to set the context, and you've already mentioned some of the causes, but it is noteworthy that while there's more genomics research being done, the amount of indigenous populations, the cohort is actually becoming a smaller sliver as there's maybe some outreach. And so I'm interested to hear from you to just expand a little bit on what you think the main causes for this reluctance is. And also, I mean, one further question is, like, should the aim be to expand the proportion? I mean, maybe some of these reluctance issues are sort of structurally there for an important reason. And yeah, so I'm just going to leave that there as a provocative, like, extra question to just see what you think about it.
Yeah, I kind of want to focus on that word reluctance. I think that's what everyone assumes, but in actuality, what's happening is that we're not even invited to the table. People have this perception that, oh, Native people don't like science, are against it, and they already have this perception, and they don't even invite us to the table. So a lot of times, tribes are not against science. A lot of the geneticists I know are Navajo and also Indigenous. So I think that I think it's both sides, that the scientists and institutions aren't thinking, or already have this conception that we don't want to be involved and don't invite us in the first place, and then do all of these amazing projects. And then from the tribal perspective, we're never invited, and also, who cares? We have our own priorities. I think priorities are probably providing for your family, getting running water in many cases. I think our family just got running water 20-ish years ago, and I know a lot of communities still don't have running water. So genetic research is definitely not a priority for us. But yeah, I think that's one of the issues, one of the main issues. And also I feel like there's such a divide between the communities and academic research. I grew up in my community and didn't know what research was. I understood I was really interested in biology and everything around me, but I didn't realize what that meant in a research context. So I think that's also a divide that separates more of this work from happening. And as for whether we should increase the numbers or not, I think that it depends. I think a lot of communities at least the ones I'm working with, are really interested in how this can benefit their communities. And so a lot of the work I focus on is biomedical related. If I were doing something related to population history or ancestry, they've told me they're not very interested in that. So it depends. And so the slide I showed was a genome-wide association. So not a lot of, there hasn't been a lot of genome-wide studies in Native populations, in part because of the NIH. If you do a genome-wide study, you are required to deposit that data in a publicly available database. So that has also halted a lot of research with tribes. With the genetic research I've done, we've actually been very selective in the genes that we pick. All the genes are approved by the Tribal Review Board, and we do deposit that data in a database, but we use aggregate data as opposed to individual data sets. So that sort of maintains the anonymity of the individuals. And since we're working with small tribes, often we report geographic locations rather than the specific tribe where that genetic data came from. So I think there's a lot of issues, and I think that a lot of people are having these conversations right now. from me personally as a geneticist, I would like to see that sliver increase, but I would like to see it increase because Indigenous researchers and tribes are doing this in partnership rather than rather than doing helicopter research, coming into the community and leaving and never coming back.
So I wanted to speak really quickly to that idea that was on the figure that Dr. Claw showed, this idea of benefits. So a number of issues that have kind of been touched on revolve around that apparent lack of benefits back to the tribe. If IHS is the main provider of your healthcare, and IHS is definitely not thinking about personalized approaches to medicine, which is where a number of those genome-wide association studies are trying to get, then what are you going to get out of it? Because of these histories that Dr. Rivers was talking about, specifically revolving around extractive or actually destructive medicine, if there's no obvious benefit back, why would you do that? And I think that that's where some of this issue comes back to, and that's one of the reasons that I spoke to this idea of governance of the research program. So there's efforts that I'm involved in right now to basically take the research program that's typically done by academic institutions and have it be based from tribal entities themselves. So the tribes are dictating the research agenda, and they're dictating the terms in which this research occurs. It's not to say that academics shouldn't be doing it or can't be doing it, but it needs to be done in a specific way such that those motives and those outcomes are clear.
And I just really wanted to underline what Dr. Claw just said, just because I thought it was totally cool, and I'm learning. It's really, I think, important to think about the divide between biomedical and population ancestry stuff, right? Because I think that biomedical, it makes sense to me. We do a lot of work in the Choctaw Nation on medicine and dealing with issues within the tribal space in southeastern Oklahoma, and I can see clear benefits. In terms of population and ancestry, you really have to be sensitive to the fact that Native nations don't really want to be told where they come from, and they don't want to be told what percentage of genetic component they have with different tributaries that are conceived of as coming across the Bering Strait. I mean, none of those things, when I talk to Native peoples, they're not particularly interested in that. That's not, and that feels colonialist, right? But biomedical research is different. So I think keeping an eye on the different ways in which different kinds of research can benefit tribal communities is really important. That's great.
And I think it depends on the tribe too. We have many researchers in Sing who are actually doing population history research with the tribes, but with the tribes' permission and blessing and involvement. So it really depends.
And is there a kind of population ancestry research that you can see tends to appeal to tribes more, other than that kind of like how to parse out the migration from Asia? I mean,
Yeah, so Dr. Whippin Mali from University of Illinois has a partnership with a tribe in British Columbia where they're actually, they sequence ancient ancestors as well as modern individuals, and they wanted to show continuity across time, and it showed exactly that, the genetic data. So that tribe has been in that place for thousands of years, and they've actually used that information for land settlements current day. So I think, yeah, so they're using the information as well. Mm-hmm.
So can you give examples of research projects that you think have been particularly successful in collaborating and meeting the needs? You already gave just one, but meeting the needs of a tribe or Indigenous population. And also, if you want to include examples of epic failures in meeting those needs, as a contrast, that might also be useful to sort of let the audience and all of us in the conversation see the range of possibilities.
Let's see. I'll start with an epic failure. Not me personally, but I know back in the early 2000s, the Genographic Project was a project that led by many researchers. They were interested in getting sort of a population fingerprint of everyone from around the world, and they specifically targeted indigenous populations, and I think this was a part of their flyers before they disappear. So obviously indigenous people all over the world did not like this at all, and actually formed a sort of a coalition against the Genographic Project, and they were not very successful, and a lot of tribes told them not to come to their communities. So in response to that, there was an article that was published, the Indigenous Peoples Against Biocolonialism, so that was published around that time, also in part in response to the Genographic Project. So that was an epic failure, I think.
What's the one you taught me about where the tribe gets their DNA, their genes?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, the Havasupai,
another epic failure
Sorry.
was actually in Arizona. Many people have heard of the Havasupai tribe. The Havasupai tribe live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and they had formed a relationship with an anthropologist in the 1990s, and I think they had a good relationship, but I think in the late 90s, they started another project related to diabetes and collected a lot of blood samples from individuals of that tribe. And this was in partnership with Arizona State University. And sometime in the early 2000s, I think early 2002, a tribal member was in the audience of someone's dissertation defense, and that individual was presenting results on the tribe related to population genetics and migration, which was not approved by the tribe. So this tribal member asked if they got consent, and the poor student. but still, I don't. So this resulted in a court, or the tribe sued Arizona State for not using the samples properly without their permission, and it was actually settled out of court in 2010 with Arizona, the Board of Arizona Regions providing compensation to the tribe, as well as returning all the DNA samples from the tribe and individuals. So it was a breach, or the issue was really the consent, where the consent was very broad, but what was verbally given or told to the tribe was that this would focus on diabetes only, and that, but in the end, their DNA had been used to look at population history, population migration, schizophrenia, and many other studies. The researcher in charge of this, Dr. Teresa Marca, she shared those samples with people all over the United States. She never apologized. When she left ASU, she actually got a promotion at, I think, University of California, San Diego. Yep. So to this day, she has not apologized to the tribe and admits no wrongdoing. So, yep, that happened pretty recently.
So we'll give at least one positive example. The example that I'm at least most familiar with is called the Strong Heart Study. Dr. Claw is actually involved in another large-scale study that is a really nice example of how this can work. So the Strong Heart Study was a response built about 30 years ago to the fact that Native people were realizing that there were elevated risks for cardiovascular disease within their communities. And it has been going on for 30 years, right? Most studies, period, don't last 30 years. In fact, there's only one study that's been going on longer revolving around cardiovascular disease in the world, and that's the Farmington study. So the reason that this study has been able to continue going on for 30 years, which means that it's not the same people doing it now that started it back when it originally began, is because there's safeguards set up in consultation with a advisory group that represents tribal nations as part of the Strong Heart Study, which involves 12 different tribes in 3 different centers at Arizona, Oklahoma, and then in South Dakota. So as new people are brought on, They're brought on with certain expectations and guidance from previously investigators that have previously been involved in the study. Every research example is vetted by the Community Advisory Group and an internal review board that authorizes release of the data for that researcher to do the study. All publications are vetted prior to seeing the light of day. And so there's a lot of checks and balances and oversight in place, and that has generally worked. So only one tribe has dropped out of that study in its entire duration. That leads me to a negative example that actually has nothing to do with the Strong Heart study, but how your interactions with the tribal community can affect not only your research, but others. So the one tribe that dropped out of the Strong Heart study is the Salt River Pima tribe. They dropped out of the study not because Strong Heart did something wrong, but because the National Science Foundation was trying to strong arm them into a separate study. And so they kicked the NSF officers out, and then tribal council said, you know what, forget it, we're done with everything, and kicked everyone out. So one of my undergraduates, a Blackfoot woman, was working on a Strong Heart study data set just 2 years ago when this happened, and we had to do what you do when somebody disenrolls. We had to remove all the data and reanalyze it, right? Which pushed her back about 1.5 years in work and affected pretty much everything coming out of the Strong Heart study. So when someone behaves poorly, it ends up affecting not only their work, but work more broadly, which is important.
So I'll ask one final question, and then I'll open it up to the audience, so think about questions that you want to ask. So just the question is, and this is somewhat related to the final remark, what can institutions like OSU do to encourage the kinds of research that builds trust, is ongoing, is collaborative, and supports equitable outcomes for underrepresented populations?
Well, one of the things that's been really gratifying in the last couple of years as Director of American Indian Studies here is that I've had the opportunity to participate now in 2 job searches where tribal candidates were being brought to campus as somebody who was involved in the process. And I think that's really important. I mean, everybody here knows way better than I do how this could be implemented, but I certainly think that as we have a growing number of tribally enrolled faculty across the units, I think it becomes much more imperative that if anyone is even considering doing scientific research with a particular tribal population, that they consult tribal faculty. I think that probably needs to be put into some kind of more official system of governance at OSU, but like I said, Matt would know way more about how that would be implemented than I would in the sciences.
So I've been thinking about this a lot, basically ever since I got here. I have a lot of ideas, and I don't think Ohio State will easily concede any of them, but here we go. So when I got here in 2016 in the fall, and the number of Native students I saw drop from 2016 to 2017, from 2017 to 2018, from 2018 to 2019, at which point we had only around 40 to 50 self-identified, so not necessarily tribally affiliated, Native students in a campus of almost 60,000. Less than almost 0.01%, right? Or 0.1%, sorry, which is lower than the state average, despite the state having no land-based federally recognized tribes within its boundaries, right? Way less than the country's average. So if Ohio State is supposed to be representative of the population it's serving in the state of Ohio, we should at least look like the state's population, and we don't. We don't, and that's a problem. And this is an issue in admissions. There is no dedicated Indigenous or Native admissions officer overseeing recruitment and enrollment of these students. We have some really good staff support on this campus, but one of those people is actually multiple of those people are doing their own doctorate degrees simultaneously, which means they are spread very thin. So the support that's in place for these people, for both the administrators as well as the students, is not where it needs to be. So why am I kind of harping on these aspects of providing kind of a foundation for people that are here? Because that's how you're going to build relationships with tribal communities, is by having people here at Ohio State that represent their own groups. So if you're interested in working with them, or if their tribe has something that they're interested in trying to see if there's an academic partner for, those relationships need to be in place. If they're not in place, Ohio State is never going to get an opportunity to engage anywhere with that. And to me, that's really important. The acknowledgement of Indigenous Peoples Day was a good step forward for Ohio State, but Native presence on this campus is still nearly non-existent. There's no powwow that's been held on Ohio State's campus for, what, like 20 years?
Before I came, yeah, so 15 years?
Yeah.
At least.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
And part of that comes back to the Native and the faculty and student population. As far as I know, I'm the only Native faculty member that's ever been in a STEM field on this campus. So that's a problem. And then the last part is outreach. So it's Eastern Shawnee that are beginning to interface back with Ohio State, which is great. That is just beginning to happen following displacement over 100 years ago at this point. So more outreach to different tribal communities that have called this home, which Dr. Claw acknowledged when we first opened, in order to re-invite them back to what is fundamentally their land, right? Land grant institutions exist because people were displaced off the land, and that's why the land was given away. It wasn't that they removed ranchers or farmers. Typically, it was Native people they removed and then gave that land out to the state. So this land was Native land before it became a UN institution, and that those relationships being healed will help with this process. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, it's well said.
Those are. Yeah, I agree. I was just thinking of two things that I've seen at other institutions. The University of Washington and University of Arizona actually have a designated tribal liaison officer or an official. So this is a position that's directly in the president's office at the university. So these individuals help bring the community or the tribal community into the university, but also if a tribe is really interested in a research project, that would be the person they would contact, and then that person could find a researcher they can work with. The other thing that was, oh yeah, and University of Arizona actually has a tribal research regulation document where if any faculty wants to work with a tribe, they have to follow whatever's on that regulation document, which includes getting tribal IRB approval or working with a community or doing community engagement. So, so that's the first that I've ever seen a university having. So that was really great to see. The other is that a lot of biomedical researchers are required to take the CITI training, so a CITI training. So the University of Washington actually modified this training and for an American Indian Alaska Native focus. So for any researcher who wants to work with tribal communities, they can take this training, and it's available online now. So anyone could take that training and show that they have taken this training, they know a little bit more about tribal communities and how to work in those communities.
So now we're going to give an opportunity to ask questions in the audience. Please keep the questions short, and Lav is going to walk around with the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, at the local level, there are clinics around the country, there are health kind of agencies and places where people receive care. Is it possible that in a well-run system, those local organizations could do some of this bridging in terms of connecting or kind of understanding what concerns are at the local level and kind of linking those local concerns to researchers who have expertise in those areas, and kind of doing some of the pre-work to find trusted, culturally competent researchers, matching those up with people who groups who have research questions. Like, could the Indian Health Service kind of play any of that role if they had enough money or enough resources of other sorts?
Well, they're seriously underfunded at this point. The IHS is in a real crisis, which is pretty much the state of its existence since 1952. And So my mama lives in Northern California, and she only has Medicare, and so she goes to a Indian health clinic in Santa Rosa, and it's pretty awful, I have to say. She's had pretty substandard care. It's been a real difficult situation, but I think that even she counts among the lucky of the diasporic Native peoples, that she has a clinic actually 20 minutes away from her home. So I think it shows the problem with the urban-rural more than almost any other issue, because the clinics that are satellite clinics that are outside of homelands are severely underfunded and are sparse in many spaces. I also think that it would be difficult because of the intense distrust that most tribal peoples have of the IHS. The IHS is not really considered a friend, and at least in my experience. That's a little anecdotal, I guess, but I would think it would be an uphill battle. But I don't know, has there been evidence of IHS being a research partner, you all? Has it operated?
No. I think I would probably get further along coming in as a researcher independent of IHS. So, but there's not a lot of, I don't see a lot of, there's a divide, I think, between what's happening at IHS and what's happening in the research field. So I would love to figure out ways to bridge that gap, but so far it's been a little hard. But yeah.
What do you think about that, Matt?
Yeah, so I think part of the division that exists is the way that IHS often brings on its clinicians. So its clinicians are usually not those that have options to be able to go wherever they want to.
Right.
And so a lot of the clinicians you get are kind of towards the bottom of average, right? And that's going to make it more challenging for these kind of bridges to be built, because those are the physicians that are not necessarily the ones that are interested in taking on those added responsibilities beyond what the job simply describes.
But I think it'll change as we're getting a lot more Native physicians and a lot of people who want to work in the rural areas with their own tribe. So I think it'll change. It's changing.
Yeah, thank you all for presenting. This is very important, very helpful. And part of my question, I think, has been somewhat answered. But just to be explicit, in terms of starting a study, right? Do you start with the tribal liaison, if they have one? Do you start with the tribal council, the tribal IRB, if they have one? And two, how far along into, I have a research question, do I get to the study design, the IRB creation? Where along that process should I, be in contact, from the very beginning, be in contact with whoever at the tribe? So just sort of a blueprint for starting, I guess.
Yeah. I guess that's also a case-by-case sort of basis. But I would say if you had no contacts there with the tribe or anyone, I would actually talk with researchers who've worked with the tribe in the past and just get their sense of what it is like to work with them. But yeah, I would make the relationships first before you propose a project. And then when you propose a project, have people involved in the whole process. Sometimes it's hard because community engagement is not necessarily funded by many grants, but there are a couple of grants out there that help you make those relationships. So yeah, I don't know if that helped, but yeah, I try to involve people from the very beginning before I even submit a grant, which makes it harder, but I think it makes it more stable. You have to build that foundation, that stable base before you start adding things to it.
One thing to just kind of add to that, although did a good job of covering pretty much all of it. Expect the process to move very slow, because a lot of this is going to be relational, and so they're going to need to know you beyond what doing a study at the hospital or doing a study somewhere in the state is going to. So it's going to take potentially years before you're going to get anywhere to doing data collection or specimen collection.
And I guess that's one of the questions that's come up for me for the two of you as I sit here and listen as a scholar. I mean, in a way, it's like welcome to my nightmare. I mean, my oral history projects take my last one took 10 years. I mean, 250 people because of this relational aspect, right? It's really quite complicated. And as I think about what that would demand of your field, that really seems like a shift. And for you all, I can see that being really maybe even a good thing and powerful to engage in. But what about grad students? If the goal is to have Indigenous grad students coming up and have their work facilitated, how can you all as mentors, are there ways that you can have it not take quite so long for them? Because they have to get out and get jobs.
Okay, well,
I'm curious.
I won't make any jokes about grad students being stuck in our lab, but this actually builds exactly on what Dr. Plow was saying. So by having relationships with certain tribes that I'm working with,
Right.
grad students can come in based on those relationships as long as I'm willing to vouch for them, which hopefully I am because they're my grad student.
Totally.
Right?
Right.
And as long as they're trained ahead of time, hey, this is how to approach it, then there shouldn't be too many missteps that I have to be as worried about.
Yeah.
So they can enter into their work very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And part of that is, again, this relational aspect. And so, for example, a graduate student that is going to be working on a project at Cheyenne River is probably going to spend not just like a couple days on Cheyenne River, but I've talked to them about spending months at Cheyenne River.
Totally.
So that they're there. People get to know who they are and they're around.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, and a lot of my postdocs, so I stayed at University of Washington to work with the Northwest Alaska Pharmacogenomics Research Network, which works with tribes in Alaska and Montana. So I came in not knowing any of the tribal groups they were working with, but they had already established those relationships way before I came along. So as a postdoc, I was able to quickly jump in, and with my skills, I was able to help analyze data sets and present to the groups as well and get to know people. But it was really the investigators of the center vouching for me to come into the communities.
Very cool.
You had mentioned getting group consent. Is individual consent also collected? And so when you do a group consent for a tribe, then you start doing individual consent? Is that how the process works then? And then so if a tribe as a whole withdraws from a study, as you had mentioned, the Pima tribe, does that automatically disenroll all the individuals, or what is the right of the individual to stay in a study if they want to, even if a tribe is withdrawn?
Do you want to start?
You can start.
Okay. So in that particular case, the tribal policy change overrode any individual interest in remaining in the study. That's going to be, I would argue, probably more generally true than not. Where once a tribe takes a certain stance, the individuals do not have a choice as long as they remain on tribal lands. So one of the things that genomics research is currently trying to better understand is this urban population, which is no longer within the boundaries of tribal jurisdiction and therefore could move from group consent past to individual consent alone. And that is a very gray space right now that a lot of people are thinking in because there is no clear answer for what that would look like.
But I think that any individual, if they were interested in being a part of a study, I don't think, like, even though my tribe has a moratorium on genetic research, if I really wanted to be a part of a study that, I don't know, some type of study, I could do that on my own as an individual, so.
I'm curious, as researchers, how you balance the dynamic between working with institutional or medical center IRBs versus tribal IRBs. Do you ever see any dialogue between those IRBs? Do you think it would be beneficial to have a tribal representative on the institutional IRB, or having them work in kind of their own parallel but different paths? Does that seem effective as well?
Yeah, I haven't. Let me see. Yeah, I don't see much interaction between them, though. It's hard to know which one to go to first, because one of the tribes I work with wanted me to get my institution IRB approval before I came to theirs, but sometimes it's the opposite way. So, yeah. But I don't see much interaction between them. I think it would be great to have a tribal representative on the IRB, though.
Of course. Oh, sorry, Matt. Of course. I mean, forgive me if I'm just I'm telling you all something you know already. But the IRB here at Ohio State requires us to, in detail, outline any kind of conversation we're having with vetting institutions that are local or that are outside of OSU. So in the event that I was in relationship with a tribal IRB, there's a whole section on the IRB approval here at OSU where I would have to detail that exhaustively, and that would put them, they would be aware of that. I'm not sure the degree to which, I've never been in that situation, but I'm not sure the degree to which then OSU IRB would facilitate communication between themselves and that tribal IRB. I kind of doubt that would happen, but that would be part of the record. They would want to know the IRB partners. And for me, when I train my grad students in oral history, I teach them that the IRB, which we're still subject to, there's been federal congressional changes, but OSU has decided to keep historians within the framework. I always tell them not to worry about it overly, because the IRB, in my opinion, sets the lowest ethical bar. I mean, everything that an institutional IRB like Ohio State would require of me is really an of course thing for me. That my ethical concerns, I'm an LGBT historian, so I have to make sure and not situationally out people if they don't want to be outed, for instance. That goes far beyond what the IRB here would require of me or my graduate students. So I tend to caution my students to think of it as just simply a baseline, and their ethical requirements extend beyond that. Anyway.
Yeah, so I've had to do exactly that. And tribal IRB at Ohio State always happens before any medical center or arts and sciences type IRB.
Oh, wow.
So, yep, that's the order here.
And they stipulate that? OSU stipulates that?
Ohio State requires all that documentation as part of the IRB submission, and
Right,
it's
right.
a freaking pain in the butt. But you know what? You got to do it.
Yep.
So.
Totally.
So I'll ask another question that wasn't that just came up with one of the things that Dr. Rivers said, and it's really about the distinctive nature of genomics research. And so one of the things that you mentioned was the sort of history of exploiting contractual relationships with one individual to represent a group. And I kind of want to know, like, given that you are doing genomics research, if there are these sorts of issues that prop up with genomics research that wouldn't necessarily prop up in other biomedical research, that we should be keeping we should be keeping tabs on.
All right, so a couple thoughts on that. If you look at genomic studies that have been done with Indigenous people in North America, you're going to find a small handful of studies that exist in Canada. I think there's like 4 or so. Genomic studies have been done in Canada on different First Nations groups. There's 0 in the United States. And so if you look at this idea of extrapolation from few data points, that is absolutely a feature of genomic sciences, because we're talking essentially about allele frequencies. We're not talking about absence presence most of the time. And so you can make a lot of missteps assuming that because you've been able to sequence, a set of genes or even the whole genome, a couple people, that's going to be representative of the population. That's simply not going to be true. And since there's not been any large-scale whole genomic studies within Native groups in the United States, I think for now it's dangerous to say too much about anything.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up that I think genomics is pretty distinct, because when your whole genome is sequenced, you're not only telling information about yourself, but you're giving away half of your siblings' information, half of your parents' information, even your first cousins, second cousins. By sending your information to 23andMe, that's also giving away your family's information. So I think it's distinct in that I don't think other types of research necessarily do that, but with your genome out there, it's out there. So 23andMe, unless you specify that you don't want to be included in their database or future research, then I don't know what they do with that data, but but supposedly you're not included in future analysis. So, but it's making people a lot of money, and I don't know if anyone's heard of the recent cases revitalizing cold cases, and the FBI is using some of these databases that you thought you were just sending your sample to look at your ancestry. They're using these databases to find criminals or people who are related to those criminals. So I think that it has a lot of privacy issues, and these are some of the things we need to think about in the future, not only for Indigenous people, but for everyone.
Yeah, and Dr. Claw's comments make me think of Erna Paha, who I just sat with for 3 days in Grand Junction. It took Erna like 2 hours of our preliminary discussions to explain to me how powerful family was in the Navajo culture. Like, it was so distinct for her. She wanted to explain to me what the sense of responsibility she grew up with in the 50s on the Navajo reservation was. And she was trying to explain to me a culture in which obligation and duty to family was so foremost that individualism in the way that I was asking her questions about coming out and her own trajectory, and she was saying, you have to understand what the obligation to the elders is and was in that space in the 1960s. And so it's up to the researcher to have to be open to understanding what community sense of obligation is, right? And that relationship between the individual. Even in this question, we're asking about an individual's right. The notion of the individual right, near and dear to my heart, understand, right? But that's a complex consideration just in what I just learned about Navajo space in the 60s, right? So I think that those are important things to keep in mind.
Well, if there are no further questions, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much. Please give a round of applause to the panel.